Hello everyone, this is Professor Gunner, and I come to you with another lecture today. And unfortunately, though we don't get to be in class, we are starting a new unit. So we've done some interesting and important things so far. First, we started off with the fundamentals. We talked about what critical thinking is, how it's done, the properties of arguments, fallacies, things like this. After that, we read a few of Plato's dialogues. We read his Euthyphro, and his Apology, and his Crito. And I think this was a good place to start with philosophy, because it presents for us pretty easy and simple arguments and reasoning, but it is also the historical starting point of this discipline that y'all are taking a class in. So Plato, to get our feet wet, I think was a good move. The tricky part, however, is that while there's a lot more in Plato that we didn't get to, and a lot of important things, we still haven't addressed some of the fundamental questions of philosophy. We're going to be doing that this week by reading Bertrand Russell's Problems of Philosophy. So, if we imagine our exploration of philosophy as an image of like getting into the pool, basically what we did with Plato is we put our feet into the pool. Well, now with Bertrand Russell's Problems of Philosophy, what we're going to do is we're going to swim down. We're going to investigate the water. We're going to see what's in it and what's going on. And it is in this work that we also get mentions of other important philosophical figures, like Descartes, Locke, and Berkeley. Later, we're going to basically swim around the perimeter of the pool, and we're going to expand our scope even more. But for now, we're diving more deeply into it. This is a wonderful text, I think, for students to read because it does a few important things. First, it serves as a fine example of what philosophy is. It also shows us how philosophers do philosophy, the kinds of questions that they ask, the kinds of things they're investigating and they're exploring. More specifically, by looking at this work, we're going to go into the fields of metaphysics and epistemology. These are what you might think of as, well, the grounding fields of the discipline. Metaphysics studies the nature of reality. It asks things like, what is time? What is space? Where did all of this stuff come from? How did it get here and how does it work? The fundamental questions of reality. Epistemology also forms a fundamental part of philosophy. It is the study of knowledge. It asks, well, okay, what is knowledge? How do we get knowledge? How do we know when we have it or when perhaps we've lost it? What are the conditions for knowing something? What is required for knowledge? And we're diving into these two fundamental fields because, well, arguably, all your other beliefs about the world, all your other views are going to be informed by your metaphysical and your epistemological views. Ethics, how you think you should live, what you think is right and wrong, how you think society should be organized, whether or not USF, for instance, is holding up its social political end of the bargain and giving you a good education. All of these views that you might have, views about the economy and markets, business, all of these are based in and informed by your metaphysical and epistemological presuppositions. For instance, do you think God exists? If you do think God exists and you're a Christian, that is going to inform all of your other beliefs. Where you think the world came from, how you think it should work, what you think is right and wrong, etc. Similarly, free will is a question in metaphysics. What is free will? Does it exist? Well, your views on that are going to inform what you think is right and wrong, how and why people should be held morally responsible. What is the human mind? Where does that come from? How does that work? Your metaphysical views about the mind are going to influence, well, how you think you should interact with other people, what it means to be a human person, how we should all live together. So all of your ethical and social and political and economic beliefs are all going to be informed by your metaphysics and epistemology. That is why we're getting into it. That is why we're going to start investigating it. And I think Russell's Problems of Philosophy does a good job at providing the student of philosophy with an introduction to these kinds of questions, and how we might, through careful reasoning and critical thinking, pose potential answers to these questions and back them up with strong arguments. Okay, well, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into Chapter 1 of Problems of Philosophy. What I'm going to do in this lecture with you is I'm going to give you just a brief summary of what Russell is doing in the text, and then I'm going to introduce you to a few different metaphysical and epistemological views on how the world works and how we obtain knowledge. With these different frameworks, you're going to, well, have the tools necessary to reflect on your own beliefs and try to work out what all of this is and what's going on. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Russell takes his starting point as noting something significant. He says that we take for granted that we know all kinds of things. For example, you would probably claim to know that you're awake right now, that you're watching this lecture, maybe that you're taking notes, that some person is your mother, some person is your father, that the world is messed up. You probably think you have knowledge of a lot of different things. We all think this way. But what philosophy does is it doesn't take those things that we think we know for granted. It actually investigates them. Thus, the basis of philosophy, Russell says, is based on the distinction between reality and appearance. We saw this a little bit in Plato already, but what the philosopher is trying to do is they're trying to get behind the way the world appears to us, to actually trying to work out, well, how does it actually work? What's actually going on? For instance, there's a desk in front of me right now. It is smooth, it has a wood color. When I rub on it, it's not bumpy. Well, all of these are appearances. All of these are perceptions in my mind. What is the table actually like? Well, that's what philosophy tries to investigate. Basically, philosophy, as that field of study which seeks to pursue the truth and knowledge, is doing just that, and trying to back it up with reasoning, evidence, and argumentation. Which is why a critical thinking class like this is a philosophy class. We're trying to improve our thinking and reasoning. We're trying to construct good arguments and justifications for our beliefs. So, he goes into, well, writing about a mundane object like a table in order to help show the reader how philosophy works and what philosophers do. What can we learn from simply looking at or thinking about a table, or this water bottle, for instance? You're seeing this water bottle. How does it look to you? Well, you see that it has a cap, it has a little handle here, a top, it's cylindrical in shape, it gradually changes its color from black to gray, right? It's in a certain place in space-time. You're having all these perceptions of the water bottle when you look at it. But just reflect on that a little bit. If I put this water bottle at the back of the room, will you see the exact same thing? No. If I put it in front of the window over there, will you see the exact same color? No. What we find and take for granted as we move through life is that we all have perceptions of the stuff around us. But the stuff around us, like tables and water bottles, heck, what happens on the street, we don't always agree on what it is that we're seeing and experiencing. Something like a car crash, or a water bottle, or a table appears differently to different people. If you and I were comparing, say, the color of this water bottle, well, depending on where it was in the room, and where you were standing and where I was standing, we would probably disagree on the color. But, as you know, appearances can be deceiving. We shouldn't just merely accept what people tell us. We shouldn't just merely accept whatever it is our eyes and ears, nose, mouth, and sense of touch is telling us about the world, because we can make mistakes. Thus, when Russell's talking about the example of the table, he notes, it doesn't appear like we can find out what the objective color of the table is. Because again, the color is going to appear differently to different people under different conditions. Similarly, if you were to rub your hand across the table in front of you, it might appear smooth, but what would you find if you looked at it more deeply? Well, if you had an instrument like a microscope, you would see it's not smooth at all. It has an incredible number of bumps. It looks like a mountain range, perhaps, when you're looking at it with that resolution. So it doesn't seem like even a mundane object like a table has a definite objective texture that we can discover. Similarly with the other qualities of the table. Depending on where you're standing in the room, its shape is going to look different to you than another person. Depending on if you're hot and cold, or if you just came in from outside, its temperature is going to feel different to you than somebody who's stayed inside and is touching the table. And what we know from physics is that because, well, velocity is relative to your frame of reference, we might even say the motion of an object doesn't have an objectively true motion, depending on your frame of reference. If you're moving slower than it or faster than it, it's going to appear to have a different kind of motion. So what we discover when we investigate just a mundane object like a table is that any claims about the real table we claim to be seeing and talking about is based on our subjective experience and our subjective sense perceptions. The table appears differently to different people. It appears differently depending on your perspective, where you're standing, how you're feeling, whether or not your eyes are working, as well as another person's. It's just that because other people seem to agree with us in communication about the color of the table and how it feels and whether or not it's moving, because people agree with us, we might think we know objectively what the table is like. But if we're just basing our knowledge of the table on these sense perceptions, what our sense organs are giving us, we'll see that they disagree with other people oftentimes. It's just that on the basis of our sense perceptions, we make inferences about what the table is really like. So we're left to wonder, is there such thing as the real table that has objective properties that don't depend on our perception? If so, what is the real table like? Well, this kind of investigation is the purview of metaphysics. What lies behind the appearances that the world is giving us? What is the world actually like? So, in order to proceed along this investigation, Russell provides us with some important guiding terms in answering these questions. He defines sense data as impressions we get from the senses. For instance, when you look at this pair of nail clippers, what do you see? What appears to you? Well, probably a silvery color, right? Probably, some sort of triangular shape you're noticing. If you were able to feel it or touch it, you'd probably think that it's smooth. What our senses give to us, Russell defines as sense data. Smells, sounds, temperatures, colors, tastes, textures, etc. Constantly, our eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and sense of touch are giving us all this information about the world. Those smells and sounds and feelings are sense data. Along similar lines, he defines a sensation as the feeling or experience of sensing the world. So, for example, if you were to rest your hand on a stove, you would feel a sensation of heat, of hotness. What that experience feels like, that is a sensation. So, let's take these terms and apply them to the example of the table. We might think that we come to know what the table is really like through sense data, but whatever perceptions we're having, these are distinct from what the table is objectively like. Thus, we should ask, what exactly is the relationship between the sense data that we have, the appearances and perceptions that we have of the world, and stuff out there in the world? Is there a relationship between them? Is what's in here matching what's out there? Well, if we're going to rely on our senses to tell us about the world, we better hope that what's going on in here matches what's going on out there. But it's not so easy. Thus, philosophers have come up with a lot of different views and arguments to try to describe our relationship to the world and what the world is actually like. These kinds of views are attempting to answer questions like, is there such a thing as matter that makes up all of this stuff? Or perhaps, is all our ideas of the world just made up in our minds? And perhaps there isn't objects out there in the world. If matter does exist, we might further ask, well, then what the heck is it? Science tells us that there's this underlying substance called matter that is made of things like atoms and waves, and these atoms are arranged in a particular way, and the way the atoms are arranged gives rise to the properties of that object and what things are like. Well, what is matter? If we claim that this thing makes up everything else in the universe, well, how does it work? What is it fundamentally? These are some of the things that metaphysics explores. So, in the service of giving you all tools to help guide you along this process of asking questions about the world and how you come to know it, if you know it at all, I'm going to introduce to you now just a few philosophers who have come up with, well, intuitive and interesting views that try to answer these questions. We're going to start with John Locke, who was an English philosopher that wrote on epistemology, metaphysics, and social political philosophy. So many of the views that we accept and take for granted in this country politically, what's written about in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, we owe to this guy and his political thought. But today, we're going to be looking at his metaphysical and epistemological views. First and foremost, Locke formulated a theory about how it is we come to have knowledge about the world. This view ended up giving rise to, well, a big debate during the modern philosophical period between the rationalists and the empiricists. Locke was an empiricist. He believed that our knowledge of the world is obtained primarily through our senses. What we see, feel, experience, hear, touch, taste. So it is our senses that is giving us all this information about the world. And then what happens is our minds, on the basis of that sense data, form ideas in our minds that somehow represent the objects that are out there. Thus, how do we come to know and understand the world? Well, it's primarily through experience. That is what gives us the building blocks of our knowledge. Metaphysically, he was a dualist. He thought that reality fundamentally is made up of two unique fundamental substances. What he called the material, and what we often call matter, and an immaterial substance. Everything in the universe could be placed in one of these two categories. What is a water bottle? Well, it's a material, physical thing. But what is the human mind? Well, Locke thought that our minds are not physical like a water bottle or a desk is. Rather, our minds are non-physical. They're made up of a different kind of substance. Likewise with our ideas and our perceptions. And so the reason why we're starting with Locke is, well, he provides a pretty intuitive picture of what a human being is and how that human being comes to knowledge about the world. A commonsensical picture, if you will. He says, this is the way things are. There are physical objects out there in the world, like water bottles and nail clippers and keyboards. Those objects have certain objective properties, and they exist independently of us. It's just that when we go out into the world and when we interact with these things, in virtue of the properties those objects have, they cause us to have certain ideas, certain representations of the world in our minds. And he further distinguishes between those ideas that we might come to have about the world by talking about their different qualities. Objects, he says, have different qualities, which he defines as the power of a thing to produce an idea in the mind. Objects first have what he calls primary qualities. You can think of these qualities as properties inherent in the object itself. So, out there in the world, when there's something like a water bottle, Locke would say, objectively, this water bottle has a cylindrical shape. It has a solidity to it. It is extended in space. It takes up room. And objectively, it is either in a certain rate of motion or it's at rest. And objectively, there's only one water bottle here. These are the primary qualities of this water bottle. The objective properties of the thing that, well, determine the way that the thing is, regardless if we're around or not. If we were to all die tonight, this water bottle's shape, and that it's extended in space, and that there's one of it, and that it's motionless, it would still have those qualities. Primary qualities. Objective properties inherent in objects. Well, he distinguishes primary qualities from secondary qualities. These, he say, are qualities that are based on the primary qualities of an object, but they're not a real part of the object. Stuff like colors, sounds, and tastes. For instance, when you go to Chipotle and you order the white cilantro rice, Locke would say, objectively, those rice grains have a certain shape. Objectively, there's a certain number of rice grains in your burrito. But the color of the rice grain, or what the rice grain tastes like, those things are not in the rice grain itself. They don't form an inherent part of the object. Thus, objects have primary and secondary qualities that inform the ideas that we have of them. Why do we see this water bottle as cylindrical? Well, it's because objectively it is cylindrical, and that cylindrical shape is forming the idea of cylinder in our minds when we look at it. Thus, Locke paints a pretty commonsensical picture of the world for us. He says, look, everything in the universe has its own independent existence, you might say. And how do we learn about the universe? Well, using our non-physical minds and through experience, we come to have knowledge of all of these different things, all of these objects. We can also use reasoning and reflection to come to new knowledge, but primarily, the building blocks of our knowledge come from experience. They come from sensing and handling, tasting, touching, smelling things. Makes sense, right? This is probably the commonsensical view that you have. That there are objects outside of you, those objects are causing you to have certain ideas about them, and, well, by experiencing the world, you learn about it. Okay. So far, so good. Well, Locke's commonsensical picture ends up getting critiqued heavily by Irish philosopher and theologian Bishop George Berkeley. Berkeley accepts Locke's empiricist picture. He thinks, yeah, how do we come to learn about the world? Well, it's through experience. It's through sensing things. But, he says, Locke, you didn't take empiricism to its logical conclusion. If you actually understood empiricism, you wouldn't hold this commonsensical picture that you do. First, he attacks Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities. What does Locke say again? Well, look, there are qualities that are inherent in objects themselves, primary qualities, and then there are the secondary qualities that just make us have certain perceptions and ideas of that object that aren't in the object itself. Berkeley denies that such a distinction exists at all. He says, no. On the basis of our experience, we cannot prove that there are properties or qualities inherent to this thing that are a part of the object itself. Rather, all qualities or all properties an object has exist relative to the person perceiving them. For instance, we might like to say that this ring has an objective shape. Locke would want to say this, but Berkeley would say no. Whether or not you think this ring has an objective shape, well, that's going to be informed by your perspective. Imagine if you just saw it like this. You would think that it's a line or something and not a circle. Where we are standing, how we're feeling, what our minds are like. Our perspective is what informs how things appear to us. And that's the case for all of the things we think we know about the object. So Berkeley would say, we can't say definitively that there is objectively just one water bottle here. Similarly, we can't say that it has an objective shape. It looks to us that it has a particular shape, but again, that shape is going to depend on your perspective, where you're standing, where you're looking at it from, how far the water bottle is away from you, etc. If we take our experience seriously, Berkeley says, what we realize is that all we have access to is our perceptions of the world. On the basis of our perceptions and ideas, we make claims about what the world is like, but we don't have any way of proving that. How do we come to know what the world is like? Well, It is through our perceptions and our ideas. Our perceptions and ideas are all we have access to. We are not capable of standing outside of our own minds and viewing things objectively. All we can work on, the only basis we have for the way we think the way the world works is through our own individual ideas and perceptions. Continuing on, he provides a famous tree thought experiment in order to show, well, what our relationship to the world is. Imagine a tree in your minds. Just close your eyes. Okay, are you picturing a tree? Okay, what does that image look like to you? Well, maybe you were envisioning a tree like coming out of the ground, with a bushy top. Maybe you pictured a tree like from the top down and, it just looked like leaves, maybe some sticks poking out. What reflecting on something as simple as a tree shows us is that we cannot imagine an object unperceived. If we try, imagine that there's an object nobody is looking at. What do you notice? Well, through your imagining, in you trying to picture an object that nobody is looking at in your mind's eye, you're sneaking in a perceiver. You're looking at that object if you try to imagine that. What does this show? Well, Berkeley thinks this shows all of this talk about objects having their own existence out there in the world with their own objective properties. If we say things like that, we're engaging in a logical leap. Again, all we have access to is our own ideas and perceptions. That is what we have to work on. And we reflect. When we reflect on that, we realize the perception of an object and the object itself are somehow inseparable. Thus, he forms a radical thesis. He says, esse est percipi. In other words, from Latin that means to be is to be perceived. In other words, we cannot prove at all that there are objects outside of our own minds with their own existences. Instead, what he's saying is that, look, because all we have to work on and base our claims off of is our own perceptions and ideas, that should lead us to think that, well, that commonsensical picture that we had from Locke isn't right. Not only can we not prove it, but this thing that scientists call matter is just an abstraction that humans have formed with their minds. An object is not made of this thing called matter. This is what the scientist would tell you, right? The scientist would say, look, Locke is right. There are objects outside of your own minds that are physical and that have their own existence, and they would stay there if we all disappeared tonight. Berkeley says, you can't prove that. You can't demonstrate that at all. What is an object? Well, it's not a physical thing. Berkeley says what objects are just bundles of perceptions or qualities. Since the existence and perception of a thing are inseparable, and only minds can have ideas and perceptions, Berkeley argues the existence of all of this stuff depends on minds. Objects will not exist without minds. Thus, he offers us not dualism, that there are two substances that make up the world, the physical and the immaterial, but rather he says it's all mental. The mental makes up everything. The universe is only made up of minds and ideas. There are no physical things. And even if there were, you would not be able to prove that they're physical, because the only way you have access to the world is through your mind and your perceptions. And those are not physical things, he says. Those are mental things, immaterial things. Now, this view seems crazy to a lot of people. They think Berkeley is saying, well, okay, so whatever's in the world is just a hallucination? It's just a figment of my individual subjective imagination? Are you saying, Berkeley, that there isn't regularity out there in the world? It's just all a subjective illusion that I'm creating? Berkeley says no. Berkeley does not deny that there is a world outside of our own minds. What he's denying is that those objects in that world is made of some sort of physical substance. Berkeley sees that there's regularity in how the things out there in the world behave. It's not as if what we pick up is a subjective hallucination. It's not as if this is all just a figment of my imagination or your imagination. Rather, he says, the eternal divine mind of God is what's holding everything together. God is the ultimate cause of all ideas. In other words, God is the one who has determined what all of these objects look like and how they behave. God is the cause. God created the universe, which is only minds and ideas, and he established laws for how these ideas are formed and how they appear to us. How these things that are ideas, like water bottles, appear to us. This is what Berkeley calls the laws of nature. Those regularities that God baked into the universe that inform their behavior and how they appear to us. Thus, he denies Locke's commonsensical picture. He denies that there are any physical or material things, and he insists, if we really reflect on this issue and we take empiricism seriously, yes, we come to know things through experience, but what we thought made up objects in the world, matter, doesn't exist. It's just an abstraction formed by the human mind. God is the one that's in control. God is the one who's determined how everything works and how everything appears to us, and God is holding everything in existence through his perception of it. Thus, the world isn't physical, it's mental. And all objects, ideas, and things depend on God's mind for their existence. They operate according to God's will and plan, and, well, he's the one that is presiding over and maintaining the existence of everything. Kind of a weird view, right? Well, this kind of idealism that Berkeley is pushing is a subtype of monism. If dualism says that there are two fundamental substances that make up the things in the universe, monism says there's only one underlying substance that makes everything up. Berkeley's theory is a monist theory. He says there's only one substance that makes everything up, and that is the mental mind. Well, you could take the other view. If you didn't want to be a dualist and think that matter and mind are two fundamentally distinct and separate things, you could go the other way and say, well, like the scientist does, all that exists is the physical. This is what we're going to call, in this class, the contemporary scientific view. And it has a few parts. Firstly, it says, nature is the only thing that exists. Thus, it argues for naturalism. Everything that exists or could exist is just a part of or a product of nature. There are no supernatural things that exist. Thus, no gods, no spirits or ghosts or demons, nothing like that. Everything is natural and comes about through natural processes. In contrast to dualism, which argues that the human person, for instance, is made up of a physical body and a non-physical mind that are distinct and different, the contemporary scientific view would say, no, insofar as the universe is natural, and insofar as everything in the universe is physical, what that basically means is what you're calling a mind is just your brain. Matter, this underlying substance, is what makes everything up. And just through physical explanations of how these physical things work, like chemical reactions, electrical impulses, neurotransmitters, that kind of stuff, just by bringing that stuff up, we can hypothetically explain all that there is to this universe. Thus, for example, if we know what the physical constitution of the human brain is, and we know all the different biochemical reactions that are happening in it, and all those chemical reactions are just following the laws of nature, someday we'll be able to determine, just based on the physical makeup, what someone might be feeling or thinking. The contemporary scientific view, in contrast to saying God created everything, offers us a different origin of the universe. It says, well, really, the Big Bang is responsible for bringing everything into existence in our reality. And at some point on, this planet, life spontaneously arose, and it is the natural process of evolution that has determined the traits that organisms have, and which organisms have lived and which have died, and how they've mutated, and why organisms are the way they are today. Thus, the contemporary scientific view denies that God exists, denies that supernatural things exist. Again, they think everything is natural and everything is physical. And God isn't needed to explain how any of this works or where it came from. So, the kind of view that it is offering us is this. Everything in the world, in the universe, has its own independent existence. And it's made up of physical stuff. This water bottle's physical. This watch is physical. Our mind is just physical. All these physical things follow natural laws and processes. And thus, somehow, with our physical brains, we can kind of come to knowledge of how things work through experience and observation and experimentation. The contemporary scientific view. Okay, so we've gotten three views on the table. Locke's commonsensical picture, which is dualist and empiricist. Then we have Berkeley's view, which is idealist and empiricist. And then finally we have the contemporary scientific view, which is materialist and empiricist. All of these offer us a different picture for how the world works and how we come to know it. We are just starting off here. As we move through the rest of this week, we're going to look at, other views on what this stuff is and how we can come to know it. Alongside me introducing those views to you, you're going to be reading Bertrand Russell, who's going to be providing you with a great example of how one engages in philosophical thinking, how that raises problems and questions, and how we might use philosophy to provide answers to those. Okay. I think that'll serve as a fine introduction. Thank you very much. If any of this was confusing or you found it difficult, I would just encourage you to watch the lecture again. You can always look up some of these theories and figures on Google and do your own research. But if you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to come to me. I would be happy to try to explain it to you or clarify anything. Thank you very much, and I will see you later this week. Bye.